Hello and welcome. My name is Thomas Kevin Dolan, the author and writer of Little Fag, A Journey of Self-Acceptance and Healing. And today I'm going to read Chapter 9, When Fear Ceases, and it begins on page 260 of my memoir. There were moments I would choke on the enormity of it all. There were moments I couldn't manage. There were moments when the answers weren't available to me. There were moments when my past loomed too large. My head buzzed with noise, and I would feel physically ill with remorse and regret. Truth is very frightening. What I braved. I have this story that I tell the truth in life, and when I do, I'm guided by divine light and always declare that the universe is partnering in everything I do. Truth gets me there. One morning while parking my car here in Honolulu, I scraped the side of someone's Lexus. Early that morning, I wedged my hand against the kitchen counter. In some way, the accident with the car was not all that unusual. Scrapings that morning seemed to be a theme. I see forward out of only one eye, so I have no depth perception. I do not have binocular vision. My brain knows the world is three-dimensional. My driving skills and walking skills often don't. What startled me more than the metal and plastic rubbing together was an almost immediate sense of not wanting to tell the truth about what I just did. What played out instantly was a narrative of me bolting from the scene with the excuse being it wasn't my fault for hitting the car. After taking a breath, I realized fear was momentarily running my life. Fear is the cheapest room in the house, and my work is to see myself in better living conditions. I acknowledged being scared and simply stood quiet for a moment. It was always from a place of fear that I was not able to tell the truth. Once the feeling in my stomach subsided, I began to feel empowered. I have learned how to honor my feelings. I've learned how to recognize fear. In my lifetime, prior to learning its nuance, I have allowed it to steal decades from my life. I moved towards the car to assess the damage and was able to wipe away the plastic that was transferred from my car to the black Lexus. It seemed like there was little damage. I had also pulled a business card from my wallet, intent on writing a note and asking the driver to call me. I was going to tell the truth. Instead, I walked away, quickly jumping into my car and moving it into another parking stall. I marveled at my stealth and justified it by thinking there was no damage, and maybe no one saw the accident. I slipped the business card back into my wallet. I dashed off for my 9 a.m. appointment, which I quickly realized was actually at 12:30. This type of confusion seemed to make sense, given the collision I just had. So I walked back to my car, looking over at the black Lexus I scraped up against with my white Honda. Before I unlocked the vehicle, I felt this whisper from my heart which said, "Are you really thinking about not telling the truth about what you created?" I froze. Suddenly, a flood of circumstances that I did bolt from in my life began to play in my consciousness. I felt sick. This is how I led most of my life. I was a liar. I studied and steadied myself and gently whispered to my heart, "I am bigger than the fear that wants me to lie." In that moment, I declined the temptation for my ego and pulled the business card back out of my wallet. In placing the card inscribed with, "I scraped the side of your vehicle. Please call me at this number," on the driver's side window, I felt whole again. This is the practicum from life I live for. It was an opportunity to not be afraid and asleep in my life. My work was to tell the truth. What I braved that day was recommitting myself to truth-telling. I chose to be self-compassionate. I found the courage to love myself even when I noticed a part of me wanting to live from a place that lacked integrity. To this day, and months after the incident, I giggle because After all that insightful work I did, no one ever responded to the note I wrote. The story reminds me of the value and commitment to truth-telling, even when, in and of the world way, it doesn't make sense. The unlearning. The fear I lived in as a younger person was addictive. I noticed my friends, who were healthier than me because their parents weren't alcoholic, feel fear occasionally. When I was in awe of their ability to deal with it constructively or to simply be able to ignore it. I was one of those kids who was driven by fear in everything I did. I grew up in uncertain conditions that caused feelings of intense fear while I waited for the next violent blow-up, for the next piling on of emotional pressure and stress, or even for the next silent treatment that left me wondering if I even mattered or if I was loved. In my childhood, fear was real. It ruled the roost. So it made sense I was destined to become a fear-based adult. The sense of loneliness I was left with was inescapable. Years ago, while writing for a Vancouver-based queer magazine, I wrote a piece that postulated that my prince wasn't coming for me, and that no one would rescue me. It was my work to rescue myself, and ultimately be my best love. Within the framework of the Adult Children of Alcoholics, or ACOA program, I learned that only I could come for me. It may sound simplistic, but this is where and how I was rescued. Not by someone else, but by my own willingness to seek change. I, not some prince, would come for me. I finally learned that only I could release the grip that fear had on my life. It was up to me to leave the sense of loneliness and isolation behind. It finally dawned on me that I had choices, that I could stop holding myself hostage. I began to examine my reality and understand that most things I feared couldn't hurt me unless I let them. It was the dynamic of fixating on these things that did the real damage. Although it took some time, as I grew in my experience of emotional sobriety, I taught myself to replace fear with love and have compassion for myself. The unlearning for me was to stop believing in the fairy tale. With self-compassion, I'm able to place my fears in their proper light so as to stay on this path of self-healing. It wasn't an easy lesson. Although when I think of that lesson, and the lesson was this, that somebody was coming for me, that in my case, as a queer man, a prince was coming to save me. The heterosexism I grew up with, right, that was invasive for me, told me, right, and I watched, right, younger girls, young women, under the umbrella of patriarchy rolled up with misogyny, this notion that, some man was going to come and rescue them. I had to undo that for myself, but to do it silently, right? It wasn't a conversation I could have with my parents. It wasn't a conversation I could have with my teachers, not in the 60s and 70s. So I had to unravel this big system, right, called heteronormative, to be able to pull out and realize that, first of all, what would it be like to have a prince come from me? And then ultimately realize that I needed to be the prince in my life, which was really scary, because at that time, I wasn't very good at being anything in my life, actually. So this notion of me being the prince was unrealistic. So when I rolled all of this experience together, as I began to realize the amount of fear that existed in my life, it wasn't until I could begin to feel it in my body, use my body as a truth teller, right? The science of lie detection is actually based on the measurement of discomfort in our body. So I began to notice where fear arrived in my body, which for me is my stomach, and I began to take time to acknowledge its presence and not think it away. Why are you here? What is this about? to simply sit with this fear, acknowledge its presence, allow it to be for the period of time it needed to be. And I think science suggests that feelings actually are present with us for maybe 13 to 17 seconds. What I wasn't good at, right, because I was taught to chase emotion or feeling away. My family hardly ever felt anything because they were just terrified and sad and angry all the time. So that was the norm for them. But I was called in a really gentle way, and then would learn, right, in some great therapy work and some great coaching work, to be able to welcome. Right? Rumi has a poem called The Guest House. And it simply says that all of these feelings or emotion, right, are like visitors from beyond. They're here to teach us something. They have a lesson for us. But we're the ones that need to welcome them, right, with all of what it is that they bring, because they do have a lesson for us. So I learned how to do that. So once I realized that I predominantly lived from fear, my work was to understand what was the lesson that fear was bringing to me, which was really, I could talk for a whole day on the lessons from fear. Be able to learn how to welcome it, be able to use my body compass, right? That part of me that knows when an emotion or a feeling lands, where is it in my body? There's a representation, right, in a body of work that Louise Hay did to suggest that when something shows up in our body, some kind of sensation, it actually means something. So for instance, a pain in your neck represents an inability to turn and look at something, right? Something in your throat might suggest that you're challenged to actually say what you want to say, right? Lower back pain represents an inability to believe that the universe is supporting you. And in my case, when that energy or feeling showed up on my stomach, which was fear, my job was to learn how to welcome it, let it be there until it passed, and then inquire to that feeling, what lesson do you have for me? So you can well imagine the richness. And then ultimately, because I'll always be able to live from fear, right? That'll be with me until I take my last breath. The opposite of it, right, which I also learned to embrace, was courage. Right? Courage to be able to move through life in a way that had me be brave. Right? That was really important. So I think the point of what it is that I want to share with you, maybe you can relate. Relate in a way to be able to recognize when fear shows up for you. Is it in your stomach? And if it is, can you sit with it and just allow it to pass? And then can you inquire to that feeling, right, in a quiet, eyes closed, breathing kind of state for yourself, what lesson it had for you? So I learned so much about being afraid in my life. And it's not that I'm not from time to time, but now I have fear, and fear doesn't have me.